The war in Vietnam introduced American soldiers to a kind of combat that defied their training and experience. Unlike the open fields of Europe or the island campaigns of the Pacific, the jungles of Southeast Asia were environments where visibility dropped to mere feet, where sound traveled strangely through dense vegetation, and where the line between hunter and hunted could reverse in seconds. The triple canopy jungle, named for its three distinct layers of overhead growth, created perpetual twilight even at midday. Movement through such terrain was slow, exhausting, and nerve-wracking. Every step had to be calculated, every sound analyzed. The ground itself could betray a soldier's position, and the enemy had learned to use the jungle not just as cover, but as a weapon. By late 1967, American forces had been conducting combat operations in Vietnam for over 2 years. The initial optimism that superior firepower and mobility would quickly wear down Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had faded. What replaced it was a grinding reality of patrols, ambushes, and engagements that often ended inconclusively. The enemy rarely stood and fought in the open. Instead, they withdrew into the jungle, regrouped, and struck again when conditions favored them. For American infantry units, this meant constant tension, constant movement, and the knowledge that contact could come at any moment or not at all. In Binh Duong Province, northwest of Saigon, the jungle was particularly unforgiving. The vegetation grew so thick that even with a machete, progress could be measured in yards per hour rather than miles. Vines hung from trees like tripwires, thorns caught on uniforms and skin. The heat was oppressive, the humidity so thick that sweat never dried. Soldiers carried 70 to 80 pounds of equipment through this terrain, including ammunition, water, rations, radios, and weapons. Exhaustion was constant, dehydration a persistent threat, and yet the work continued, because the alternative was to cede entire regions to an enemy who knew the ground far better than any map could reveal. The patrol in question consisted of a reinforced rifle platoon from a line infantry company, approximately 35 men, led by a lieutenant with 6 months in-country experience. The platoon sergeant was a career soldier on his second tour, a man who had learned to read the jungle through hard experience. The mission was classified as a reconnaissance in force, a term that meant moving through a designated area, looking for signs of enemy activity, and developing the situation if contact occurred. On paper, it was routine. In practice, nothing in the jungle was ever routine. The area of operations had seen light enemy activity in recent weeks, a few sightings, some old trails, nothing to suggest a major presence. Intelligence reports indicated that a Viet Cong local force company, perhaps 70 to 80 fighters, operated somewhere in the region. These were not regular North Vietnamese army troops, but guerrillas who lived in the villages, fought when opportunity arose, and melted back into the population when pressure increased. They were lightly armed compared to American forces, carrying mostly AK-47 rifles, a few machine guns, and RPG launchers. But they knew the terrain. They knew where to wait, and they knew when to move. The patrol departed their firebase in the early morning, moving in a standard column formation. The point man led, eyes scanning the ground and vegetation ahead. Behind him, a rifleman and the squad leader. Then the main body with the platoon command group in the center, radio operators staying close to the lieutenant. The rear guard kept watch behind, ensuring nothing followed unseen. Movement was slow and deliberate. Every 10 meters the column paused, listened, watched, then moved again. This pattern continued for hours. The only sounds were boots on damp earth, the rustle of equipment, and the distant calls of birds that grew silent as the soldiers passed. The fire base they had left behind was typical of hundreds scattered across South Vietnam. A small hilltop position surrounded by concertina wire, sandbag bunkers, and a few mortar pits. Perhaps a company-sized element called it home at any given time, rotating out on patrols while others provided security. Artillery pieces were positioned to provide fire support for patrols operating within range. A landing pad allowed helicopters to bring supplies and evacuate casualties. It was not a comfortable place. Dust in the dry season, mud in the wet season. But it was safer than the jungle, and soldiers returning from patrol felt genuine relief when they passed through the wire and into the perimeter. By mid-morning, the platoon had covered roughly 2 kilometers. The jungle had grown denser. The canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight, creating a greenish gloom that made distances hard to judge. The ground became uneven, rising and falling over small ridges and draws that did not appear on the map. Water was everywhere, pooling in low spots, dripping from leaves, soaking through boots and socks. The men's uniforms were dark with sweat, faces were streaked with grime. But the discipline held. No one spoke unless necessary. Hand signals conveyed information. Eyes stayed outward, scanning the vegetation. The point man was a soldier on his 8th month in country. He had learned to watch for disturbed earth, broken vegetation, and the subtle signs that indicated human passage through the jungle. He moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. His rifle was held at the ready, selector switch on semi-automatic. Behind him, the squad leader maintained a distance of about 5 meters, close enough to respond if the point man made contact, far enough to avoid being caught in the same burst of fire. This spacing was critical. Too close and a single machine gun could hit multiple soldiers. Too far and mutual support became difficult. The lieutenant called a halt near a small stream. The men spread out into a defensive perimeter, each soldier covering a sector. Canteens were refilled using purification tablets. A few men ate crackers from their rations. The radio operator made contact with the firebase, reporting their position and status. Everything was normal. No enemy contact, no signs of recent activity. The stream was clear, the banks undisturbed. If the Viet Cong were in the area, they had left no trace. The water in the stream was cool and clear, a small relief from the oppressive heat. Soldiers filled their canteens, added the iodine tablets that would make the water safe to drink in 30 minutes, and continued to scan their sectors. Some pulled leeches from their arms and legs, applying insect repellent to the wounds. Others checked their feet, looking for signs of immersion foot, a condition that could become debilitating if not addressed. The jungle took a toll on equipment as well. Rifle cleaning was a constant necessity. The humidity caused rust. Dirt and vegetation fouled mechanisms. A weapon that was not maintained daily could fail when needed most. What the Americans did not know was that they had been watched since shortly after leaving the firebase. Viet Cong scouts moving parallel to the patrol had tracked their progress and sent runners ahead. The local force company commander received word of the American movement and made his decision quickly. He would not engage near the firebase where American artillery and air support could respond within minutes. Instead, he would wait, let the patrol move deeper into the jungle, let them follow the terrain into ground he had already prepared. His men had been operating in this region for months. They knew every trail, every ridge, every place where visibility dropped and movement slowed. They knew where to position a machine gun for maximum effect, where to place riflemen to create overlapping fields of fire, where to withdraw if the situation turned against them. The Viet Cong commander was a man in his early 30s, a veteran of fighting against the French and then the Americans. He had survived by being careful, by choosing when to fight and when to avoid contact. His men trusted him because he did not waste their lives. Every engagement had a purpose. Every ambush was planned with escape routes identified. He understood that his force could not defeat the Americans in a prolonged fight. Their firepower was too great, their support too responsive, but he could inflict casualties. He could create fear and uncertainty. He could make them understand that nowhere in the jungle was safe. The Viet Cong commander had perhaps 60 fighters immediately available. More could be called if needed, but that would take time. His plan was simple: allow the Americans to enter a natural choke point where a stream cut through a narrow valley, dense vegetation on both sides, limited visibility, difficult terrain for maneuvering. He would position his main force on the high ground to the east, with a smaller blocking element to the west. When the Americans were halfway through, he would initiate the ambush with concentrated fire, pinning them in the valley. If the Americans tried to assault his position, the terrain would slow them. If they tried to withdraw, his blocking force would engage. Either way, he believed he could inflict casualties and break contact before American support arrived. His fighters moved into position quietly. They had practiced this many times. Each man knew his place. The machine gunner selected a position with clear view down into the valley, protected by a fallen log and dense undergrowth. Riflemen spread out along the ridge, spacing themselves to create a line of fire roughly 60 meters long. The blocking element moved to the opposite side, fewer in number but positioned to catch anyone attempting to withdraw back along the trail. Fighting positions were shallow scrapes in the earth, just deep enough to provide minimal cover. The Viet Cong did not build elaborate positions because they did not intend to stay long. This was a temporary setup for a single engagement. By early afternoon, the American patrol reached the area the Viet Cong commander had selected. The stream valley was obvious on the map, but from ground level, it appeared to be simply another feature in endless jungle. The lieutenant consulted with his platoon sergeant. The terrain ahead would slow them, but moving around would cost time and take them off their planned route. The decision was made to proceed through the valley. The point element moved forward, followed by the main body. The column stretched out as soldiers navigated the uneven ground and thick vegetation. The platoon sergeant felt uneasy. It was nothing specific, just a sense that something was wrong. The jungle was too quiet. The birds had stopped calling. Even the insects seemed subdued. He had felt this before on his first tour, just before an ambush near the Cambodian border. His squad had taken casualties that day because they had ignored the warning signs. He was not going to make that mistake again. He moved forward to speak with the lieutenant, suggesting they slow down, perhaps send out flanking elements to check the high ground. The lieutenant considered this. It would take time. It would spread his force thin. But the sergeant's instincts had proven reliable before. The order was given. The column halted. 2 fire teams began moving laterally, one toward each side of the valley. The rest of the platoon waited, weapons ready, watching the vegetation. The soldiers selected for the flanking teams moved carefully. They understood the risk. If the enemy was out there, the flankers might walk directly into them. But they also understood the greater risk of continuing down the valley without checking the high ground. They moved in, pairs, covering each other, weapons held ready. The vegetation was so thick that they could barely see 10 meters ahead. Every step required pushing through vines and undergrowth. Progress was measured in meters per minute. The main body waited, and in that waiting, tension built. Soldiers adjusted their grips on their weapons, checked their magazines, scanned the tree line for any movement. The Viet Cong commander saw the Americans halt and send out flankers. This was not part of his plan. If the flankers reached his positions, they would compromise the ambush. He faced a choice. Initiate the ambush now before the Americans were fully in position, or wait and risk discovery. He chose to initiate. A whistle sounded, shrill and brief. Immediately, rifle fire erupted from the eastern ridge. The sound was sharp and rapid, distinct from American weapons. AK-47s fired in short bursts. A machine gun opened up, its heavier cadence cutting through the lighter rifle fire. The American column reacted according to training. Soldiers dropped to the ground, seeking what cover existed. Return fire began almost immediately, directed toward the muzzle flashes on the ridge. The radio operator was already calling in contact, giving grid coordinates and requesting fire support. The lieutenant assessed the situation rapidly. Enemy fire was coming from elevated positions to the east. His platoon was strung out along the valley floor. He needed to consolidate his men and either assault the enemy position or break contact. Neither option was good, but staying pinned in the open was worse. The initial burst of fire had been intense, but not immediately devastating. The Viet Cong were firing through heavy vegetation at targets that had dropped into cover. Most rounds went high or impacted trees and undergrowth. But the psychological effect was significant. The sudden transition from tense patrol to combat was jarring. Training took over. Soldiers identified targets based on muzzle, flashes, and fired at them. The M16 rifles produced a lighter, faster sound than the AK-47s. The distinctive crack of rounds passing overhead mixed with the deeper sound of bullets impacting nearby. The platoon sergeant was moving along the line, directing fire, getting men into better positions behind fallen logs and into shallow depressions in the ground. The volume of enemy fire was significant, but not overwhelming. The Viet Cong were firing in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, aiming carefully despite the heavy vegetation. Rounds snapped through the air overhead. Leaves and bark flew from impacts. One soldier was hit in the shoulder, the bullet passing through without hitting bone. He continued to return fire, his squad leader applying a field dressing without leaving his position. The wound was painful but not immediately life-threatening. The soldier gritted his teeth and kept shooting. The flanking teams had gone to ground when the firing started. They were separated from the main body by perhaps 20 meters of jungle. The team leader on the eastern side realized they were actually between the main body and the enemy position. This was dangerous but also potentially useful. He used hand signals to communicate with his team. They would move forward carefully, trying to get a better angle on the enemy position. If they could flank the ambush from below, they might disrupt the enemy's plan and create an opportunity for the main body to maneuver. The lieutenant decided to assault. Staying in place meant accepting casualties without achieving anything. Withdrawing would expose his men as they moved and could lead to pursuit. An assault would seize initiative, force the enemy to react, and potentially overrun their positions before they could disengage. He passed the order to his squad leaders. The men understood. This was what they had trained for: fire in movement. One element providing covering fire while another advanced, then switching roles, advancing uphill through dense jungle toward an enemy in prepared positions. The assault began with intensified suppressive fire. M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers directed fire at the ridgeline. The volume was considerable, far heavier than what the Viet Cong could produce. The first squad moved forward in short rushes, soldiers advancing a few meters before dropping back into cover. The Viet Cong continued firing, but the incoming American fire was forcing them to keep their heads down, disrupting their aim. The second squad prepared to leapfrog the first, maintaining momentum. The M79 grenade launcher proved particularly effective. The gunner, a specialist with 4 months in country, began placing rounds on the ridgeline with practiced accuracy. The grenades exploded in the trees and undergrowth, creating bursts of shrapnel and concussion that forced the Viet Cong to stay low. Each round made a distinctive thump when launched, followed seconds later by the explosion. The grenadier worked methodically, spacing his shots along the enemy line, reloading quickly, firing again. This suppressive fire was critical. It did not necessarily kill the enemy, but it prevented them from firing accurately at the advancing American soldiers. The terrain fought against the assault. Soldiers scrambled over roots and through vines, weapons held ready, breathing hard. The slope was steep in places, requiring hands to pull upward. Equipment snagged on vegetation. The weight of ammunition and gear made every movement exhausting, but the momentum continued. The first squad reached a position halfway up the slope and established a base of fire. The second squad pushed through them, advancing another 20 meters. The Viet Cong fire was becoming less coordinated, individual shots rather than concentrated bursts. The enemy was starting to withdraw. The flanking team on the eastern side had worked their way to a position where they could see several enemy fighters. The Viet Cong were focused on the main assault, firing at the Americans advancing from below. They had not detected the small team that had moved laterally through the jungle. The team leader made eye contact with his partner, pointed out targets, and gave a silent count. On 3, they opened fire simultaneously. 2 Viet Cong soldiers went down immediately. The others turned, confused and alarmed by fire coming from an unexpected direction. This moment of confusion was what the assault needed. The main body surged forward, sensing the enemy position was breaking. The Viet Cong commander recognized that his ambush was not developing as planned. The Americans had reacted too quickly. Their fire discipline was good, their movement coordinated, and now they were advancing toward his positions rather than withdrawing as many ARVN units might have done. Worse, fire was coming from his flank, indicating that some American element had gotten around his position. He passed orders to his squad leaders. Continue firing, but prepare to withdraw. They had inflicted some casualties. They had engaged a larger American force. That would be enough. Staying to fight it out would cost men he could not afford to lose. The withdrawal was executed with practiced efficiency. The Viet Cong fell back in small groups, covered by others who maintained fire. They moved through predetermined routes, deeper into the jungle where the terrain became even more difficult. The machine gun crew was among the last to leave, their weapon providing covering fire until the riflemen had pulled back. Then they disassembled the gun, divided the parts among themselves, and melted into the vegetation. Within 5 minutes of the decision to withdraw, the enemy fire had ceased almost entirely. Occasional shots marked the retreat, but the main force was gone. The American assault continued up the slope. The soldiers were cautious now, knowing that a withdrawing enemy could leave behind booby traps or a rear guard to catch pursuers. But they reached the ridgeline positions without further contact. The area showed clear evidence of occupation. Shell casings littered the ground, dozens of them from AK-47s and the heavier rounds from the machine gun. Disturbed earth showed where men had been lying. A blood trail led east, but pursuit was not ordered. The jungle ahead was unknown terrain, and splitting the platoon further would be reckless. 2 enemy bodies were found in the position. Both had been killed by the flanking team's fire. They were young men, perhaps early 20s. dressed in simple clothing with web gear for carrying ammunition. Their weapons were collected: AK-47 rifles in serviceable condition, a pouch of rice, some documents that would be sent to intelligence for analysis. The bodies were searched for identification, but like most Viet Cong fighters, they carried nothing that would identify their unit or reveal useful information. They would be counted as enemy, killed in action in the after-action report, but their names and stories would remain unknown. The lieutenant consolidated his men on the captured position. A defensive perimeter was established. The wounded were treated. The soldier who had been shot in the shoulder was given morphine for the pain and a more thorough bandage applied. He was stable and in good spirits, already joking about his $1 million wound. Ammunition was redistributed. Soldiers who had expended magazines during the assault received rounds from those who had fired less. The radio operator was in constant contact with the fire base. Artillery fire was called in on suspected withdrawal routes, though whether it hit anything was impossible to know. A medevac helicopter was requested for the wounded, though the injury was not immediately life-threatening. Finding a landing zone in this terrain would be difficult. The platoon held the position for the remainder of the daylight hours. Patrols were sent out to check the immediate area. They found more blood trails, some discarded equipment, and additional fighting positions that had not been occupied during the engagement. The Viet Cong had prepared this ambush site carefully. They had cleared fields of fire. They had dug shallow rifle pits. They had positioned their machine gun to cover the valley floor. They had done everything correctly. But the American response had been faster and more aggressive than they anticipated. One patrol found a cache of ammunition hidden in a hollow tree about 50 meters from the main position. Several hundred rounds for AK-47s, wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. This suggested the position had been prepared for potential long-term use, not just a hasty ambush. The ammunition was collected and would be destroyed later. Another patrol found a small bunker system, more elaborate than the fighting positions, with overhead cover and multiple firing ports. This had not been occupied during the engagement, but showed that the Viet Cong had been using this area as a base of operations for some time. As evening approached, the lieutenant received orders to withdraw to a more defensible position for the night. Moving through jungle in darkness was dangerous, but staying on the ridgeline was worse. The Viet Cong knew where they were. Mortars could be brought up. A night assault could be organized. The platoon began moving, this time with flankers, out and rear security reinforced. They covered roughly 500 meters before finding suitable ground for a night defensive position. A small clearing, large enough for the platoon to form a tight perimeter. Fields of fire were cleared as much as possible without making excessive noise. Claymore mines were positioned. Listening posts were sent out 50 meters in each direction. The night defensive position was set up according to standard procedure. Each soldier knew his sector of fire. Alternate and supplementary positions were identified. The machine guns were positioned to provide interlocking fire across the most likely avenues of approach. The grenadier had his ammunition laid out for quick access. The radio operator maintained contact with the fire base, reporting their position and receiving confirmation that artillery fire support was available if needed. 50% security was established, meaning half the platoon stayed awake while the other half attempted to sleep. This would rotate every 2 hours throughout the night. The night passed slowly. Sleep came in short intervals for those not on watch. Every sound was analyzed. Branches breaking, animals moving, the distant sound of voices that might have been real or imagined. The jungle at night was a different environment. The darkness was complete under the canopy. Soldiers relied on hearing more than sight. Movement required slow, careful steps to avoid making noise. The claymore mines provided some sense of security, but everyone knew that a determined enemy could infiltrate the position if they were patient and skilled enough. Around midnight, one of the listening posts reported movement to their front. The report was whispered into the radio. The entire platoon went to full alert. Weapons were trained outward. Fingers rested on triggers. The platoon sergeant moved quietly to the position where the listening post's security element waited. He listened. There was definitely something moving out there. Whether it was enemy soldiers or simply animals was impossible to determine. The decision was made to wait. If it was the enemy probing the position, they would either attack or withdraw. If it was animals, no action was necessary. Minutes passed. The sounds faded. The listening post reported no further movement. The platoon remained at full alert for another 30 minutes before returning to 50% security. The Viet Cong did not return. They had withdrawn completely, moving through the jungle to safe areas where they could rest, treat their wounded, and prepare for the next engagement. For them, this had been one fight among many. Not a victory, not a defeat, simply another contact in a war that they measured in years rather than battles. Their casualties had been light, considering they had engaged a larger force. 2 dead, perhaps 4 or 5 wounded, most of them able to continue fighting after treatment. They had failed to inflict significant casualties on the Americans, but they had survived to fight another day. That in itself was a form of success. At first light, the platoon began moving back toward their fire base. They took a different route, avoiding the stream valley and the ambush site. The march took most of the morning. Soldiers were exhausted, mentally and physically drained by the previous day's combat and the sleepless night, but discipline held. Security remained tight. The point man moved carefully, watching for signs of enemy activity or booby traps. The column maintained proper spacing. When they finally reached the firebase perimeter, there was relief, but no celebration. They had done their job, they had responded to contact effectively, they had driven off the enemy, but they had not destroyed him, and they knew he was still out there. The medevac helicopter had arrived shortly after dawn, landing at a small clearing that had been identified by a reconnaissance aircraft. The wounded soldier was loaded aboard, along with the captured enemy weapons and documents. The helicopter lifted off quickly, not wanting to remain on the ground longer than necessary. For the wounded soldier, the war was effectively over. He would be evacuated to a hospital in Saigon, treated, and eventually sent home. For his squad mates, the war continued. The after-action review was conducted the following day. The lieutenant and platoon sergeant presented their account. The enemy had prepared an ambush in favorable terrain. The initial contact had been sudden and from covered positions. The platoon had responded with immediate suppressive fire and a coordinated assault. The enemy had withdrawn rather than accepting close combat. Estimated enemy casualties were uncertain. 2 confirmed killed based on bodies recovered, possibly more wounded based on blood trails. American casualties were light, 1 wounded, no killed. Equipment losses were minimal. The captured weapons and ammunition indicated the enemy had been well supplied. The battalion intelligence officer analyzed the engagement. The enemy unit was likely the same local force company that had been operating in the area for months. They had demonstrated tactical competence in selecting the ambush site and positioning their forces. However, they had shown unwillingness to remain in contact once American forces began maneuvering aggressively. This pattern was consistent with Viet Cong tactics throughout the region. Strike when conditions were favorable. Withdraw before superior firepower could be brought to bear. Preserve forces for future operations. The Americans could claim a tactical success in driving off the enemy, but the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Viet Cong would return, another patrol would move through the same area, another engagement would occur, the cycle would continue. For the soldiers of the platoon, the engagement reinforced lessons they had already begun to learn. The jungle was the enemy's ally. Terrain that appeared open on a map could be nearly impassable on the ground. An ambush could be initiated at any time from any direction. But training and discipline could overcome even a well-prepared enemy position. Fire superiority mattered. Maneuver mattered. Leadership mattered. The decision to assault rather than withdraw had been validated by the outcome. Had the platoon attempted to pull back under fire, casualties would likely have been higher. The aggressive response had disrupted the enemy's plan and forced them to react defensively. The platoon sergeant gathered his squad leaders after the review. He spoke quietly, without drama. The engagement had gone as well as could be expected. The men had performed well, but there had been mistakes. The column had been too strung out when contact occurred. The flanking teams had not been sent out soon enough. Radio communication had been difficult during the assault due to the terrain. These were areas to improve. Next time, and there would always be a next time, they needed to be faster, tighter, more coordinated. The jungle did not forgive mistakes, and the enemy was learning just as they were. The squad leaders listened and asked questions. How could they maintain tighter column spacing while still moving through difficult terrain? How could they improve communication during contact when radio traffic was saturated? How could they identify ambush sites before walking into them? These were questions without perfect answers. The platoon sergeant offered what guidance he could based on his experience. Watch for areas where the terrain naturally channeled movement. Send out flankers more aggressively when the situation felt wrong. Establish brevity codes for radio communication to reduce transmission time. trained constantly on immediate action drills so that reactions became instinctive. Small improvements in multiple areas would add up to better performance overall. In the weeks that followed, the platoon conducted more patrols. They moved through different areas of Binh Duong Province, following different routes, searching for different enemy units. Sometimes they found signs of recent activity. Sometimes they found nothing. Contact occurred twice more before the end of the month. Once, a brief exchange of fire at long range that ended when the enemy withdrew. Once, a booby trap that wounded 2 men but did not result in further engagement. The pattern was consistent. The Viet Cong would engage when they held advantage and withdraw when they did not. For American forces, this meant constant vigilance, constant movement, and acceptance that decisive victories were rare. The broader war continued around them. Major operations were launched and concluded. Casualty figures were reported and analyzed. Political debates raged in the United States over strategy and purpose. But for the infantrymen conducting patrols through the jungle, the war was immediate and personal. It was the weight of equipment, the heat, the fear, and the knowledge that every patrol could end in contact. It was the trust between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. It was the small decisions made under pressure that could mean the difference between life and death. The lessons from that engagement in the Stream Valley became part of the platoon's collective experience. They were passed on to new replacements who arrived to fill slots left by men rotating home or transferred to other units. The new soldiers, fresh from training in the United States, listened to the veterans describe what combat was really like. The training had been useful, they were told, but the jungle was different. The enemy was different. You learned by doing, by surviving your first few patrols, by watching the experienced men and copying what they did. The new soldiers absorbed this information, some more successfully than others. A few would not survive their first month. Most would adapt and become veterans themselves, eventually passing on their knowledge to the next wave of replacements. The jungle remained dangerous. The enemy remained elusive. But the soldiers adapted. They learned to read terrain better. They learned to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. They learned that aggression, properly applied, could overcome an enemy in prepared positions. And they learned that in jungle warfare there were no final victories. Only the next patrol and the constant effort to stay alive until their tour ended and they could go home. The nature of the conflict meant that individual engagements, no matter how well fought, rarely changed the larger situation. The Stream Valley where the ambush occurred saw more patrols in subsequent months. Other American units moved through the same terrain. The Viet Cong returned, prepared new positions, and conducted more ambushes. Some were successful, some were not. The ground itself remained contested, neither side able to hold it permanently. This was the frustrating reality of the war in Vietnam. Tactical success did not translate to strategic progress. Ground taken could not be held. Enemy forces defeated in one location simply reappeared in another. For historians examining the Vietnam War decades later, engagements like the one in Binh Duong Province represent the typical experience of American infantry. Not the large-scale battles that made headlines, but the small unit actions that occurred daily across South Vietnam. These engagements tested soldiers in ways that training could only partially prepare them for. The physical demands of jungle combat, the mental strain of constant alertness, the moral complexity of fighting an enemy who blended with the civilian population, the challenge of maintaining discipline and cohesion when the purpose of the war itself was increasingly questioned. The soldiers who fought in these actions were mostly young men, drafted or enlisted, who found themselves in a war that bore little resemblance to the wars their fathers had fought. There were no front lines, no clear objectives, no decisive battles that ended in surrender. Instead, there were patrols, ambushes, and body counts that served as the primary metric of success. The transition from World War II's clear moral framework to Vietnam's ambiguity was difficult for many to accept, but the men in the field had limited time for such considerations. Their focus was survival, completing their tour, and going home. The specific engagement described here is representative rather than exceptional. Thousands of similar contacts occurred throughout the war. Most were never reported beyond unit after-action reports. A few sentences in a daily intelligence summary. Grid coordinates, number of rounds fired, casualties sustained and inflicted. The human experience behind those statistics, the fear and exhaustion and brief moments of intense action, went largely unrecorded. What remains are the memories of those who served, the official records that provide a skeletal outline of events, and the broader historical understanding of how jungle warfare shaped the conflict. Jungle warfare in Vietnam challenged fundamental assumptions about military power. American forces possessed overwhelming firepower. They had air superiority. They had artillery support. They had helicopters for mobility. But these advantages were difficult to leverage in terrain where visibility was measured in meters, and the enemy could be anywhere or nowhere. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces adapted their tactics to negate American strengths. They avoided open battle. They fought at close range where air support was dangerous to both sides. They used the terrain to control the pace and location of engagements. American forces adapted in turn, developing new tactics for small unit operations, improving communication systems, training soldiers specifically for jungle combat. The patrol that fought in the Stream Valley demonstrated how training and discipline could overcome an ambush in unfavorable terrain. Their response was not perfect. Mistakes were made. But the fundamentals were sound. They returned fire immediately. They maneuvered under fire. They used their superior firepower to suppress the enemy. They assaulted aggressively rather than accepting a defensive position. These actions, performed by men under intense stress and confusing circumstances, prevented what could have been a successful enemy ambush from achieving its objectives. The Viet Cong commander had chosen his ground well, positioned his forces effectively, and initiated the ambush at a favorable moment. Yet his force was driven off without inflicting significant casualties. This outcome reflected the quality of American small unit leadership and the effectiveness of infantry training. But tactical proficiency could not solve the fundamental strategic problems of the war. The enemy could withdraw, regroup, and fight again. No amount of successful engagements could eliminate an enemy who enjoyed sanctuary across borders and support from the local population. American forces could win every tactical engagement and still not achieve victory in any meaningful sense. This reality became increasingly apparent as the war continued. The frustration of soldiers who fought well, only to return to the same areas and face the same enemy, contributed to declining morale in later years. But in 1967, when the engagement in Binh Duong Province occurred, American forces still believed that sufficient pressure could wear down enemy forces and achieve some form of success. The men of the platoon returned to their firebase after the engagement and prepared for the next patrol. Equipment was cleaned and repaired, ammunition was resupplied, reports were written, and then they went out again, into the same jungle, knowing that contact could come at any moment. This was the routine of infantry combat in Vietnam. Not constant action, but constant tension. Long periods of exhausting movement punctuated by brief, intense firefights. The psychological toll was significant. Soldiers learned to function despite fear, to make decisions under pressure, to trust their training even when every instinct screamed to freeze or flee. Those who served in these conditions developed a bond that transcended normal friendship. They had depended on each other for survival. They had seen each other at their worst and best. That experience shaped them for the rest of their lives. The bond between soldiers in combat is difficult to explain to those who have not experienced it. It is not based on shared ideology or even necessarily shared background. Men from different states, different economic classes, different races served together in the same platoons and depended on each other completely. In the firebase, there might be tensions and disagreements, but in the jungle, those differences disappeared. A soldier's value is measured by his reliability under fire, his willingness to share the burden of difficult work, his ability to function when exhausted and afraid. Race and background became irrelevant. What mattered was whether you could be trusted when things went wrong. The lieutenant who led the platoon during the engagement would complete his tour and return home several months later. He would leave the army and attend law school. Decades later, he would still remember the names of the men in his platoon, the sound of the firefight, the decisions he made under pressure. He would wonder whether he had done enough, whether different decisions might have prevented casualties in later engagements. These questions would never be fully answered, but they would remain with him, a permanent part of his experience. The platoon sergeant would serve 2 more tours in Vietnam before retiring from the army in the mid-1970s. He would carry physical scars from later engagements and psychological scars that were harder to see. But he would also carry pride in his service and in the men he had led. He had done a difficult job in a difficult war, and he had done it as well as anyone could. That knowledge sustained him through the years when Vietnam veterans were not always welcomed home or appreciated for their service. The war would continue for years after the engagement described here. American involvement would peak in 1968, then gradually decline through the early 1970s. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces would continue fighting, eventually achieving victory in 1975 when South Vietnam collapsed. But for the soldiers who fought in places like Binh Duong Province in 1967, the outcome was still uncertain. They did their jobs, followed their orders, and tried to survive. Their story is one small part of a much larger conflict, but it represents the experience of hundreds of thousands of American servicemen who fought in Vietnam. The jungle remains. The stream valley where the ambush occurred is still there, though the fighting positions are long since overgrown. The soldiers who fought there have mostly aged into retirement or passed away. The Viet Cong fighters who initiated the ambush have their own stories, their own memories of that day. Both sides believed they were fighting for important reasons. Both sides demonstrated courage and tactical skill. The engagement between them, lasting perhaps 30 minutes from first shot to the enemy withdrawal, was in many ways typical of the entire war. Brief, intense, inconclusive, and ultimately unable to change the larger strategic situation. Years after the war ended, some veterans would return to Vietnam. They would see the country at peace, developing economically, moving beyond the conflict that had defined it for so long. They would meet former enemies, now elderly men, and discover that the other side had experienced the same fear, the same exhaustion, the same desire to survive and go home. These meetings were often emotional. The war had shaped both sides profoundly, but in peacetime, with decades of distance, there was room for understanding, if not complete reconciliation. The engagement in Binh Duong Province is a small chapter in a long and painful conflict, but it deserves to be remembered for what it reveals about the nature of jungle warfare and the men who fought in it. It shows how well-trained soldiers could respond effectively to a sudden ambush. It shows how terrain and tactics interacted in ways that training could only partially predict. It shows the importance of leadership, discipline, and aggression in combat, and it shows the limitations of tactical success in achieving strategic objectives. These lessons remain relevant for military professionals studying small unit combat, and they provide insight into an era that shaped America and Vietnam in profound ways. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and write in the comments what the next video should be about.